Between 1950 and 1980, American grandmas guarded 30 forgotten ground beef suppers that stretched 1 pound of meat. Each recipe used cheap fillers like rice, noodles, and potatoes to make expensive beef. No waste, just Depression-era wisdom turning scarcity into abundance. Within years, every struggling family across America knew these 30 stretcher meals. Then grocery stores started selling cheap chicken in 1990, and beef stretchers vanished overnight. These are 30 forgotten ground beef suppers nobody makes anymore. Emergency steak saved American families during World War II, when real steak disappeared from butcher shops completely. Grandmas mixed 1 pound of ground beef with crushed Wheaties cereal, milk, and minced onion. They shaped the mixture into T-bone steak shapes and fried them in hot skillets until golden brown. Rich mushroom gravy poured over the top made them look like real steaks. Kids never suspected the difference. 1 pound fed 6 people for 38 cents total. The Wheaties added crunch and stretched the meat twice as far. By 1985, this wartime trick disappeared from family tables forever. Did your grandma ever make fake steaks? Shipwreck casserole got its strange name because ingredients layered in the pan looked like debris floating in the ocean. Grandmas spread raw rice across the bottom of greased baking dishes. Sliced potatoes layered over the rice, then sliced onions. 1 pound of ground beef crumbled over the vegetables. 2 cans of tomato soup mixed with water, poured over everything. The casserole baked covered for 90 minutes until the rice absorbed all the liquid. The layers cooked together into one complete meal that fed 8 people for $1.12. Nobody needed side dishes. This Midwest classic vanished by 1989. What's the weirdest casserole name you've heard? Hamburger corn pone pie combined Southern cornbread with Depression-era beef, stretching into one brilliant casserole that fed families for pennies. Grandmas browned 1 pound of ground beef with onions in cast-iron skillets. Kidney beans and tomatoes stirred into the beef created thick, hearty filling. Cornbread batter mixed from cornmeal, egg, and milk poured over the beef mixture. The entire skillet went into hot ovens and baked for 25 minutes until the cornbread turned golden brown. Shredded cheese melted over the top during the final 5 minutes. This complete meal fed 8 people for 94 cents. Southern grandmas made this weekly throughout the 1960s. Chow mein casserole brought Asian American fusion into Midwestern homes during the 1950s, when families craved exotic flavors on Depression budgets. Grandmas browned 1 pound of ground beef with diced celery and onions. Cooked white rice mixed with the beef. 2 cans of cream of mushroom soup stirred in created creamy binding. The mixture spread into greased casserole dishes. Crunchy chow mein noodles from cans scattered across the top added texture. The casseroles baked for 30 minutes until bubbling hot. This unusual combination fed 8 people for $1.08. Kids loved the crunchy noodles. By 1988, this fusion casserole vanished completely. Poor man's steak proved that Depression-era grandmas could transform ground beef into something that looked and tasted like expensive cuts of meat. They mixed 1 pound of ground beef with crushed saltine crackers, milk, and minced onion until it formed a firm mixture. The mixture pressed flat into steak shapes and chilled overnight in refrigerators. The next day, they fried the steaks in butter until crispy and brown. Rich mushroom gravy smothered the meat. This trick fed 6 people for 52 cents total. Kids genuinely believed they were eating real steak. The tradition disappeared by 1987, when beef prices dropped drastically. 5 suppers down, and every single one transformed cheap ground beef into meals that fed entire families. From emergency steak to poor man's steak, Depression-era grandmas knew exactly how to stretch 1 pound of meat impossibly far. But the next 5 recipes were even more clever at making beef go further. Porcupine meatballs got their adorable name from rice grains that stuck out of the meatballs like little quills after cooking. Grandmas mixed 1 pound of ground beef with uncooked white rice, minced onion, salt, and pepper. They rolled the mixture into golf ball-sized meatballs. The meatballs arranged in single layers in deep skillets. 2 cans of tomato sauce poured over the meatballs covered them completely. The pan simmered, covered for 45 minutes, while the rice cooked inside the meatballs and poked through the surfaces. This magical meal fed 8 people for 86 cents. Kids loved the funny name and the tender meatballs. Johnny Marzetti became an Ohio legend when a Columbus restaurant invented this casserole during the 1920s to feed broke college students cheaply. Grandmas browned 1 pound of ground beef with diced onions until crumbly. Cooked egg noodles mixed with the beef. 2 cans of tomato sauce and shredded cheddar cheese stirred into the mixture. Everything dumped into greased casserole dishes and baked for 30 minutes until bubbling hot. More cheese melted on top during the final 5 minutes. This hearty casserole fed 8 people for $1.18. Midwest families ate Johnny Marzetti weekly throughout the 1960s. Have you heard of this Ohio classic? American goulash had nothing to do with Hungarian goulash, except the name. This was pure American Depression cooking that stretched beef impossibly far. Grandmas browned 1 pound of ground beef with diced onions and bell peppers in huge pots. Cooked elbow macaroni stirred into the beef. 2 cans of diced tomatoes with their juice added moisture and flavor. Salt, pepper, and paprika seasoned everything perfectly. The entire pot simmered for 20 minutes until the flavors married together. This one-pot wonder fed 8 people for 98 cents total. Every spoonful contained pasta, meat, and vegetables in perfect balance. Kids asked for seconds constantly throughout the 1970s. Hamburger gravy over rice was the ultimate Southern comfort supper that grandmas made weekly when paychecks ran thin before month's end. They browned 1 pound of ground beef in cast-iron skillets until crumbly. Flour sprinkled over the beef created the base for gravy. Milk poured slowly into the pan while stirring constantly prevented lumps. The gravy simmered until thick enough to coat spoons. Salt and pepper seasoned everything generously. Hot cooked white rice mounded on plates, and the rich hamburger gravy spooned over the top. This filling meal fed 8 people for 74 cents. Butter melted into the rice added richness. Beef and noodle skillet was the fast weeknight supper that working mothers discovered during the 1960s, when jobs and families competed for their limited time. They browned 1 pound of ground beef with diced onions in large skillets. Cooked egg noodles mixed with the beef. 1 large can of tomato sauce poured over everything and stirred together. Shredded cheddar cheese melted into the hot mixture, created creamy binding. The entire skillet cooked for 10 minutes until heated through completely. This quick meal fed 8 people for $1.04. Only 1 pan meant easy cleanup after long work days. What's your fastest weeknight dinner? 10 ground beef suppers complete, and each one cost less than $2 to feed 8 hungry people. From porcupine meatballs to beef and noodle skillet, grandmas turned scarcity into abundance, with rice, noodles, and potatoes. But the next 10 recipes stretched beef even further with brilliant Depression-era tricks. Ground beef stroganoff brought Russian elegance into American homes during the 1950s, when grandmas discovered they could make fancy restaurant dishes using humble ground beef instead of expensive steak strips. They browned 1 pound of ground beef in large skillets with sliced mushrooms and diced onions until everything turned golden brown and fragrant. The beef fat rendered out and created natural cooking oil that made additional butter unnecessary. Flour sprinkled over the beef mixture thickened the sauce that would form later. Beef broth poured slowly into the skillet, while stirring constantly prevented lumps from forming in the gravy. The mixture simmered gently for 10 minutes, while the flavors married together beautifully. Sour cream stirred in at the very end created the signature tangy richness that made stroganoff taste sophisticated and special. The cream couldn't boil or it would separate and curdle, so grandmas removed the pan from heat before adding it. Salt and pepper seasoned everything to perfection. Cooked egg noodles arranged on serving platters, and the beef stroganoff spooned generously over the top created restaurant-quality presentation. This elegant meal fed 8 people for $1.62 total, which seemed expensive compared to other stretcher recipes, but remained far cheaper than taking the family to restaurants. The mushrooms added earthy flavor and made the dish feel more substantial. The sour cream made ordinary ground beef taste luxurious and creamy. Kids loved the rich sauce coating every noodle. Grandmas made stroganoff for special Sunday dinners when they wanted to impress without spending a fortune. By 1992, this classic disappeared as families ate out more frequently. Do you prefer stroganoff with ground beef or steak strips? Tamale pie brought Southwestern flavors to Midwestern dinner tables during the 1960s, when grandmas wanted exotic tastes without complicated techniques or expensive ingredients. They browned 1 pound of ground beef with diced onions in cast-iron skillets until the meat crumbled into small pieces. 1 can of whole kernel corn, drained and added to the beef, created sweetness that balanced the savory meat perfectly. 2 cans of diced tomatoes, with their juice poured over everything, added moisture and acidity. Chili powder, cumin, salt, and pepper seasoned the filling with warm spices that made the kitchen smell amazing. The beef mixture simmered for 15 minutes, while grandmas prepared the cornmeal topping that made this dish special. Yellow cornmeal mixed with milk, 1 egg, and a pinch of salt created thick batter similar to cornbread. The beef mixture transferred into greased casserole dishes and spread evenly across the bottom. The cornmeal batter poured over the beef layer covered everything completely. Shredded cheddar cheese sprinkled on top would melt into the cornbread during baking. The casseroles went into hot ovens and baked for 35 minutes until the cornbread topping turned golden brown and firm. The cheese melted and created a beautiful crust. This complete meal fed 8 people for $1.24. The cornbread absorbed the flavorful beef juices and stayed moist and tender. Kids loved eating cornbread and beef together in 1 spoonful. Grandmas served tamale pie weekly throughout the 1960s when families craved Mexican-inspired flavors. By 1990, Taco Bell replaced homemade tamale pie completely. What's your favorite Mexican-American comfort food? Beef and rice skillet was the ultimate one-pan supper that exhausted grandmas made on Wednesday evenings when laundry, cleaning, and gardening left them too tired for complicated cooking with multiple pots. They browned 1 pound of ground beef with diced onions and bell peppers in large, deep skillets with high sides. The vegetables softened while the beef cooked through completely. 2 cups of uncooked white rice stirred directly into the beef mixture without pre-cooking saved time and effort. 1 large can of diced tomatoes poured over everything added liquid that the rice would absorb during cooking. Beef broth added to the pan ensured enough moisture for the rice to cook properly without burning on the bottom. The liquid needed to measure exactly 3 cups total, including the tomato juice. Salt, pepper, and garlic powder seasoned everything generously. The skillet covered tightly with a lid, and the heat reduced to low for exactly 25 minutes. The rice steamed gently and absorbed all the flavorful liquid while the beef stayed tender. After 25 minutes, Grandmas removed the lid and fluffed the rice with forks. Every grain separated perfectly and contained bits of beef, vegetables, and tomato. Shredded cheese stirred into the hot skillet, melted into the rice, and created creamy binding. This complete meal fed 8 people for 96 cents total. Only one pan meant minimal cleanup after dinner. The rice provided filling carbohydrates while the beef added protein. Kids scraped their plates clean and asked for seconds. Grandmas made this skillet meal twice weekly throughout the 1970s. Stuffed peppers transformed ordinary ground beef into elegant individual servings that made grandmas feel like they were serving restaurant food during the 1950s, when presentation mattered even on tight budgets. They cut the tops off large bell peppers and removed the seeds and membranes from inside. The hollowed peppers stood upright in deep baking dishes. 1 pound of ground beef browned with diced onions in skillets until crumbly. Cooked white rice, mixed with the beef, stretched the meat further. 1 can of tomato sauce, stirred into the beef and rice mixture, created moisture and flavor. Salt, pepper, and oregano seasoned the filling perfectly. The beef and rice mixture spooned carefully into each hollowed pepper until packed tightly to the top. Any remaining tomato sauce poured over the stuffed peppers kept them moist during baking. The baking dish went into moderate ovens covered with foil for 45 minutes. The peppers softened and became tender, while the filling heated through completely. During the final 10 minutes, grandmas removed the foil and sprinkled shredded cheese over each pepper. The cheese melted and turned golden brown under the heat. This beautiful meal fed 8 people for $1.38. Each person got their own individual pepper that looked impressive on plates. The sweet bell pepper contrasted perfectly with savory beef filling. Kids loved having their own personal serving. Grandmas made stuffed peppers for Sunday dinners when company came over. The presentation made cheap ground beef look expensive and sophisticated. By 1988, this labor-intensive recipe disappeared as convenience foods took over. Do you stuff peppers with rice or breadcrumbs? Ground beef hash was the Monday night supper that used up leftover potatoes and transformed them into complete meals, with the addition of ground beef during the 1960s, when wasting food was considered sinful. Grandmas diced cooked potatoes into small cubes about ½ an inch square. 1 pound of ground beef browned in large cast-iron skillets until crumbly and golden. Diced onions added to the beef, cooked until soft and translucent. The potato cubes went into the skillet with the beef and onions and stirred together thoroughly. Butter added to the pan helped crisp the potatoes and prevented sticking on the bottom. The entire mixture pressed flat into the skillet and cooked undisturbed for 5 minutes over medium-high heat. The bottom formed a golden brown crust that added texture and flavor. Grandmas flipped sections of the hash with spatulas to brown the other side. Salt and pepper seasoned everything generously. The hash cooked for another 5 minutes until crispy all over. 2 or 3 eggs cracked directly into wells made in the hash cooked alongside everything else. The egg whites set firm while the yolks stayed runny. This hearty meal fed 8 people for $1.14 when using leftover potatoes. The combination of crispy potatoes, savory beef, and rich egg yolks created perfect comfort food. Kids loved breaking the egg yolks and watching them run into the hash. Grandmas made this every Monday using Sunday's leftover boiled potatoes. Nothing ever went to waste in their kitchens. By 1990, people stopped cooking enough to have leftovers. What do you do with leftover potatoes? 15 ground beef suppers complete, and every single one fed 8 people for less than $2 total. From stroganoff to stuffed peppers, grandmas proved that cheap ingredients combined skillfully created meals that rivaled expensive restaurant dishes. But the next 5 recipes were the most forgotten of all. Hamburger soup was the ultimate winter warmer that grandmas made in huge pots during the 1970s. When heating bills climbed and hot meals helped families stay warm without turning up thermostats. They browned 1 pound of ground beef in large soup pots until crumbly and brown. Diced onions added to the beef, cooked until softened and fragrant. Diced potatoes, sliced carrots, and diced celery went into the pot next, and stirred together with the beef. The vegetables needed to be cut into uniform small pieces so everything cooked evenly. 2 cans of diced tomatoes with their juice poured over the vegetables added acidity and flavor. Beef broth filled the pot 3/4 full and created the soup base. Bay leaves, salt, pepper, and dried thyme seasoned the broth perfectly. The soup brought to a boil, then the heat reduced to low for a gentle simmer. The pot covered partially and cooked for 45 minutes until the vegetables turned tender and the flavors married together beautifully. The soup thickened slightly as it cooked, and the vegetables released their starches. Grandmas tasted and adjusted the seasoning before serving. This hearty soup fed 8 people for $1.46. The meal provided complete nutrition with protein from beef, carbohydrates from potatoes, and vitamins from vegetables, all in one bowl. Buttered bread served alongside soaked up the flavorful broth. Kids ate 2 bowls each on cold winter nights. Grandmas made huge batches and froze portions for quick weeknight dinners. The soup tasted even better reheated the next day. What's your favorite vegetable to add to soup? Beefaroni was the homemade version of the canned Chef Boyardee favorite that grandmas made from scratch during the 1960s when they refused to pay premium prices for something they could make cheaper at home. They browned 1 pound of ground beef with diced onions in large pots until the meat crumbled into small pieces. Cooked elbow macaroni stirred into the beef created the classic combination that kids loved. 2 large cans of tomato sauce poured over the beef, and macaroni covered everything in red sauce. Dried oregano, dried basil, garlic powder, salt and pepper seasoned the sauce with Italian flavors. The mixture simmered gently for 15 minutes while the macaroni absorbed the tomato sauce and the flavors blended together. Shredded mozzarella and cheddar cheese stirred into the hot beefaroni, at the end melted into creamy strings. The cheese made everything taste richer and more indulgent. Some grandmas baked their beefaroni in casserole dishes with extra cheese on top for a crispy golden crust. Others served it straight from the pot as a quick skillet meal. This kid-friendly supper fed 8 people for $1.08 total. The combination of pasta, beef, tomato sauce, and cheese hit all the flavors that children craved. The homemade version tasted fresher and less salty than canned varieties. Grandmas could control the seasoning and make it exactly how their families preferred. Kids ate beefaroni 3 times weekly throughout the 1960s without ever complaining. The leftovers reheated perfectly for school lunches. By 1995, busy parents bought canned beefaroni instead of making it from scratch. Do you prefer homemade or canned beefaroni? Beef and potato casserole was the church potluck favorite that grandmas made throughout the 1950s when they needed to feed crowds without spending much money or using complicated ingredients. They sliced raw potatoes paper-thin using sharp knives or mandolin slicers. The potato slices layered across the bottom of greased casserole dishes in overlapping rows. 1 pound of ground beef browned with diced onions until crumbly. The cooked beef scattered over the potato layer covered everything evenly. Another layer of sliced potatoes went on top of the beef. 2 cans of cream of mushroom soup mixed with 1 cup of milk created the creamy sauce that held everything together. The soup mixture poured over the layered potatoes, and beef seeped down into all the crevices. Shredded cheddar cheese sprinkled generously over the top would melt and brown during baking. Salt and pepper seasoned each layer as grandmas assembled the casserole. The dish covered tightly with aluminum foil and baked in moderate ovens for 1 hour. The potatoes steamed and softened under the foil. After 1 hour, grandmas removed the foil and baked for another 15 minutes until the cheese turned golden brown and bubbly. The potatoes became fork tender and absorbed the creamy mushroom sauce. This comforting casserole fed 8 people for $1.52. The layers looked beautiful when sliced and served on plates. The combination of tender potatoes, savory beef, creamy sauce, and melted cheese satisfied everyone. Grandmas brought this casserole to every church dinner throughout the 1950s. By 1990, pre-made potato casseroles from grocery stores replaced homemade versions. What's your favorite potluck casserole? Shepherd's pie with corn was the British-inspired casserole that American grandmas adapted during the 1960s by adding sweet corn to stretch the filling even further than traditional recipes. They browned 1 pound of ground beef with diced onions in large skillets until the meat cooked through completely. 1 can of creamed corn stirred into the beef added sweetness and moisture that made the filling more substantial. Salt, pepper, and Worcestershire sauce seasoned everything perfectly. The beef and corn mixture spread evenly across the bottom of greased casserole dishes. Mashed potatoes prepared from scratch, using boiled potatoes, butter, milk, salt, and pepper, created the topping that made shepherd's pie distinctive. The potatoes needed to be smooth and creamy without lumps. Grandma spread the mashed potatoes carefully over the beef layer and used forks to create decorative ridges across the top. Butter dotted over the potato layer would melt and brown during baking. The casseroles went into hot ovens and baked for 30 minutes until the potatoes turned golden brown on the peaks. The filling bubbled up around the edges and created a beautiful presentation. This hearty casserole fed 8 people for $1.36. The combination of savory beef, sweet corn, and buttery mashed potatoes hit every comfort food note perfectly. Kids loved the creamy potatoes on top. The corn added unexpected sweetness that made the dish taste more interesting than traditional shepherd's pie. Grandmas made this weekly throughout the 1960s, when ground beef stayed affordable. By 1988, this labor-intensive casserole disappeared as frozen dinners took over family tables. Do you prefer shepherd's pie or cottage pie? Cabbage roll casserole was the genius shortcut that grandmas invented during the 1970s when they wanted the flavors of traditional stuffed cabbage rolls without spending hours wrapping individual rolls. They chopped 1 head of green cabbage into rough pieces about 1 inch square. The cabbage boiled in salted water for 5 minutes until slightly softened but still crisp. They drained the cabbage completely and set it aside. 1 pound of ground beef, browned with diced onions until crumbly. Cooked white rice, mixed with the beef, stretched the meat further. 1 large can of tomato sauce stirred into the beef and rice mixture created moisture and flavor. Salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar seasoned everything perfectly. Half the chopped cabbage spread across the bottom of greased casserole dishes. The beef and rice mixture layered over the cabbage. The remaining cabbage scattered over the beef created the top layer. More tomato sauce poured over everything ensured the casserole stayed moist during baking. The casserole covered with foil and baked in moderate ovens for 1 hour until the cabbage turned tender and the flavors married together. The foil trapped steam and cooked everything perfectly. This deconstructed version of stuffed cabbage fed 8 people for $1.28. All the traditional flavors remained without the tedious work of rolling individual portions. The cabbage softened and absorbed the tomato sauce beautifully. Kids ate this version more willingly than traditional cabbage rolls because the presentation seemed less intimidating. Grandmas made this throughout the 1970s when time became more precious. What's your favorite cabbage dish? 20 ground beef suppers revealed, and each one proved that Depression-era grandmas were kitchen geniuses who could stretch 1 pound of meat to feed 8 people. From hamburger soup to cabbage roll casserole, these recipes saved families from hunger during hard times. But the final 10 are the most forgotten. Ground beef and vegetable pie was the ultimate comfort casserole that grandmas made throughout the 1950s, when they wanted to create complete one-dish meals that provided protein, vegetables, and carbohydrates, all baked together under a golden biscuit crust that made everyone feel like they were eating something special and homemade. They browned 1 pound of ground beef in large skillets with diced onions until the meat crumbled into small pieces and turned golden brown. The rendered beef fat stayed in the pan and provided natural cooking oil that made the dish flavorful without adding extra butter or shortening. 1 bag of frozen mixed vegetables containing peas, carrots, corn, and green beans added directly to the browned beef without thawing first. The vegetables heated through and mixed with the beef, while grandmas prepared the gravy that would bind everything together into a cohesive filling. Flour sprinkled over the beef and vegetable mixture created the base for thick gravy. Beef broth poured slowly into the pan, while stirring constantly prevented lumps from forming in the sauce. The mixture simmered gently for 5 minutes while the flour cooked and the gravy thickened to the consistency of heavy cream. Salt, pepper, and dried thyme seasoned everything perfectly with savory herbs that complemented the beef and vegetables. The entire mixture transferred into greased casserole dishes and spread evenly across the bottom. The filling needed to be piping hot when the biscuit topping went on, so everything cooked evenly. Refrigerated biscuit dough from tubes made the topping quick and foolproof for grandmas who didn't have time to make biscuits from scratch on busy weeknights. The biscuits separated and arranged across the top of the hot beef filling covered the surface completely with just small gaps between each biscuit. Some grandmas made homemade biscuit dough using flour, baking powder, butter, and milk for a more authentic version. The biscuits baked right on top of the filling and absorbed the flavorful steam rising from below. Melted butter brushed over the biscuit tops helped them brown beautifully in the oven. The casseroles baked in hot ovens for 25 minutes until the biscuits turned golden brown and the filling bubbled up around the edges. By 1992, chicken pot pie from grocery store freezers replaced homemade beef and vegetable pie completely. The tradition of making this from scratch disappeared, along with the generation that understood that real cooking didn't take much more time than reheating frozen meals. Do you prefer beef or chicken pot pie? Hamburger potato puff was the magical casserole that grandmas made throughout the 1960s when they discovered they could combine ground beef with mashed potatoes and eggs to create a dish that puffed up like a soufflé in the oven and impressed everyone who saw it, come out golden and risen from the heat. They browned 1 pound of ground beef with diced onions in skillets until the meat cooked through completely and the onions softened and turned translucent. The cooked beef drained of excess fat and transferred into large mixing bowls to cool slightly, while grandmas prepared the potato mixture that would transform this simple beef into something spectacular. 4 cups of mashed potatoes made from scratch using boiled potatoes, butter, milk, salt, and pepper created the base for the casserole. The potatoes needed to be smooth and creamy without any lumps that would ruin the final texture. 2 eggs separated carefully with the yolks going into the mashed potatoes and the whites reserved in a clean bowl. The egg yolks stirred into the potatoes added richness and helped bind everything together. The cooled ground beef mixed thoroughly with the potato and egg yolk mixture until evenly distributed throughout. Shredded cheddar cheese folded into the beef and potato combination added flavor and helped the casserole hold together after baking. The reserved egg whites whipped with an electric mixer until they formed stiff peaks that stood straight up when the beaters lifted out of the bowl. This step was absolutely critical for making the casserole puff properly in the oven. The whipped egg whites folded gently into the beef and potato mixture using a rubber spatula with careful folding motions that preserved the air bubbles in the whites. Overmixing would deflate the egg whites, and the casserole wouldn't puff. The entire mixture spooned carefully into greased casserole dishes and smoothed across the top. The surface needed to be relatively level, so it would rise evenly during baking. The casseroles went into hot ovens immediately after assembly, because the egg whites would deflate if they sat too long. They baked for 35 minutes, until the tops turned golden brown and the casseroles puffed up dramatically like soufflés. Today, almost nobody remembers hamburger potato puff or understands why anyone would go to such effort for ground beef. Would you try making a puffed casserole? Beef and macaroni bake was the ultimate church basement casserole that grandmas made for funeral dinners and potluck suppers throughout the 1970s, when they needed to feed crowds of mourning families or hungry church members without spending much money on expensive ingredients. They boiled elbow macaroni in salted water until tender but still slightly firm to the bite, because the pasta would continue cooking in the oven and nobody wanted mushy noodles in their casserole. The macaroni drained completely and set aside, while grandmas prepared the beef and cheese layers that made this casserole so comforting and satisfying. 1 pound of ground beef browned with diced onions in large skillets until the meat crumbled into small pieces and the onions softened and released their sweet flavors into the beef fat. 2 large cans of tomato sauce poured over the browned beef created the red sauce that would coat the macaroni. Dried oregano, dried basil, garlic powder, salt, and pepper seasoned the sauce with Italian flavors that made the casserole taste like something from a restaurant rather than a church basement kitchen. The sauce simmered for 10 minutes while the flavors married together and the tomatoes cooked down slightly. The cooked macaroni stirred into the beef and tomato sauce mixture until every piece of pasta was coated with red sauce and studded with bits of ground beef. Cottage cheese mixed with 1 beaten egg created a creamy cheese layer that would set up during baking and add richness to the casserole. Some grandmas used ricotta cheese instead of cottage cheese for a smoother texture, but cottage cheese cost less and provided the same protein and calcium. Half the beef and macaroni mixture spread across the bottom of greased casserole dishes. The cottage cheese mixture spooned carefully over the beef layer and spread evenly to the edges. The remaining beef and macaroni mixture, layered over the cottage cheese, created the top layer. Shredded mozzarella and cheddar cheese mixed together and sprinkled generously over the top would melt and brown during baking. The casseroles, covered with aluminum foil and baked in moderate ovens for 30 minutes until everything heated through completely. The foil prevented the cheese from burning before the inside heated properly. After 30 minutes, grandmas removed the foil and baked for another 15 minutes until the cheese turned golden brown and bubbly. By 1995, catered food replaced homemade casseroles at church functions, and the tradition of making beef and macaroni bake from scratch disappeared completely. The recipe stayed in old church cookbooks that nobody opened anymore. What's your favorite church potluck dish? Wacky meatloaf got its strange name from the unusual ingredient that grandmas added during the Depression, when breadcrumbs became too expensive, and they needed something cheap to stretch ground beef into filling meals that fed large families. They mixed 1 pound of ground beef with uncooked oatmeal instead of breadcrumbs, and the oats absorbed the meat juices and stretched the beef twice as far, while adding healthy fiber that kept everyone full for hours after eating. 1 beaten egg added to the mixture helped bind everything together so the meatloaf wouldn't fall apart when sliced. Diced onions mixed into the beef added flavor and moisture that made every bite taste savory and satisfying. Ketchup stirred directly into the raw meat mixture added sweetness and acidity that brightened the flavors and made the meatloaf taste more complex than plain beef ever could. Salt and pepper seasoned everything generously, because under-seasoned meatloaf tasted bland and boring, no matter what other ingredients went into it. Some grandmas added Worcestershire sauce or dried mustard powder for extra depth of flavor. The entire mixture combined thoroughly with clean hands, because tools couldn't mix ground beef as effectively as fingers could. The meat needed to be mixed just enough to combine everything evenly, but not so much that it became tough and dense. Overworking ground beef made it dry and chewy after cooking. The seasoned beef mixture pressed firmly into loaf pans and shaped into rounded tops that would brown beautifully in the oven. More ketchup spread generously across the top of the raw meatloaf created a glaze that would caramelize during baking and form a sweet, tangy crust. Some grandmas mixed ketchup with brown sugar and mustard for a fancier glaze. The meatloaf pans went into moderate ovens and baked for 1 hour until the internal temperature reached 160 degrees. The tops turned dark brown and sticky from the ketchup glaze. The oatmeal absorbed the beef fat and kept the meatloaf moist instead of greasy. After baking, the meatloaf rested for 10 minutes before slicing so the juices could redistribute and the slices would hold together instead of falling apart. This economical meal fed 8 people for $1.26 total. Today, almost nobody makes meatloaf with oatmeal unless they stumble across an old handwritten recipe card tucked into a vintage cookbook. Do you put oatmeal or breadcrumbs in your meatloaf? Ground beef fried rice was the brilliant invention that Chinese-American grandmas created during the 1960s when they married Depression-era beef stretching techniques with traditional Asian cooking methods to create fusion dishes that fed large families cheaply while honoring both cultural traditions. They cooked white rice a day ahead and refrigerated it overnight, because cold, day-old rice worked better for fried rice than fresh, hot rice that would turn mushy and sticky in the wok. 1 pound of ground beef browned in large woks or skillets until crumbly and golden brown. The cooked beef pushed to the sides of the pan, creating a well in the center, where grandmas cracked 2 or 3 eggs directly into the hot pan. The eggs scrambled quickly in the beef fat and broke into small curds as they cooked. The beef mixed back with the eggs once they set firm. The cold cooked rice added to the pan broke apart as grandmas stirred everything together with spatulas or wooden spoons. The rice needed to be separated completely, with no clumps remaining, so every grain would get coated with the seasonings. Soy sauce drizzled over the rice colored everything brown and added the salty umami flavor that made fried rice taste authentic and delicious. Frozen mixed vegetables containing peas, carrots, and corn added to the pan heated through quickly and contributed color and nutrition without requiring fresh vegetables that cost more and took longer to prepare. Green onions sliced thin, scattered over the fried rice at the very end, added fresh flavor and bright color that made the dish look more appealing. Sesame oil drizzled over everything, right before serving, added nutty fragrance that made the kitchen smell like a Chinese restaurant. The entire dish cooked in less than 10 minutes from start to finish once the rice was already cooked and refrigerated. This quick meal fed 8 people for $1.18 total. The combination of savory beef, fluffy rice, scrambled eggs, tender vegetables, and salty soy sauce created perfect balance that satisfied everyone. Kids loved the fun of eating rice mixed with little bits of everything scattered throughout each bite. The fried rice tasted exotic and special, even though it used the same cheap ground beef that went into every other stretcher meal. Today, most people have never tasted ground beef fried rice because restaurants don't serve it and cookbooks don't include it. The fusion recipe vanished, along with the immigrant generation that invented it. What protein do you prefer in your fried rice? 25 ground beef suppers complete, and every single one proved that grandmas were absolute geniuses at stretching tight budgets into abundant meals. From vegetable pie to fried rice, these recipes fed 8 people for less than $2 each. But the final 5 suppers are the most forgotten recipes of all. Hamburger milk gravy was the ultimate Southern comfort supper that grandmas made throughout the 1950s, when they wanted to create filling meals from almost nothing, except ground beef, flour, milk, and bread that every household kept in their kitchens constantly. They browned 1 pound of ground beef in cast-iron skillets until the meat crumbled into tiny pieces and rendered out enough fat to make gravy without adding extra butter or oil. The cooked beef stayed in the pan with all the flavorful drippings. Flour sprinkled generously over the browned beef created the roux that would thicken the gravy and give it body and substance. The flour needed to cook for at least 1 minute while stirring constantly so the raw flour taste disappeared and the roux turned golden brown. Whole milk poured slowly into the pan while grandmas whisked constantly to prevent lumps from forming in the gravy. The cold milk hitting the hot roux created steam and bubbles that needed to be stirred vigorously. The gravy started thin and watery, but thickened dramatically as it heated, and the flour expanded. The mixture needed to simmer gently for 5 minutes, while the flour cooked completely, and the gravy reached the perfect consistency that would coat the back of a spoon. Salt and pepper seasoned the gravy generously because flour muted flavors, and the gravy needed more seasoning than people expected. Black pepper added visible specks throughout the white gravy and contributed sharp flavor that made every bite interesting. Some grandmas added a pinch of cayenne pepper for subtle heat that warmed the belly. Others stirred in dried sage or thyme for herbal notes that made the simple gravy taste more complex. The finished gravy needed to be thick enough to cling to bread without running off immediately, but thin enough to pour smoothly from a ladle. Thick slices of white bread toasted until golden brown or sliced fresh without toasting, arranged on plates, created the base for the meal. Some Southern grandmas used biscuits instead of bread for a more traditional presentation. The hot hamburger milk gravy, ladled generously over the bread or biscuits, soaked into every pore and created a complete meal that cost only 68 cents to feed 8 people. The combination of savory beef, creamy gravy, and soft bread provided comfort that satisfied both hunger and emotions during hard times. Kids soaked up every drop of gravy with their bread and asked for seconds. The meal filled stomachs completely and stuck to ribs through long afternoons of farm work or playing outside. Grandmas made hamburger gravy 3 times weekly throughout the 1950s, when feeding large families required creativity and resourcefulness. The simplicity meant anyone could make it, even without cooking skills or experience. By 1987, this Depression-era meal became associated with poverty rather than practical wisdom. Do you put gravy on bread or biscuits? Beef noodle soup was the ultimate sick day meal that grandmas made throughout the 1960s, when family members came down with colds or flu and needed something warm and nourishing that would heal their bodies and comfort their spirits during miserable days spent in bed. They browned 1 pound of ground beef in large soup pots until the meat crumbled into small pieces and released its fat into the bottom of the pan. Diced onions added to the beef, cooked until soft and translucent. Sliced carrots and diced celery went into the pot next and stirred together with the beef and onions. The vegetables needed to be cut small enough to fit easily on soup spoons so sick people could eat without struggling. Beef broth poured into the pot covered everything by several inches and created the soup base that would carry all the flavors. Some grandmas used bouillon cubes dissolved in hot water instead of canned broth because it cost less and tasted nearly identical. Bay leaves, dried thyme, salt and pepper seasoned the broth with herbs and spices, that made the kitchen smell like healing and home. The soup brought to a rolling boil, then the heat reduced to low for a gentle simmer. The pot covered partially and cooked for 30 minutes while the vegetables softened and released their flavors into the broth. The beef stayed tender, and the vegetables turned just soft enough to eat easily. Egg noodles added to the simmering soup cooked for 8 to 10 minutes until tender, but not mushy. The noodles absorbed some of the broth and expanded to nearly double their dry size. Grandmas needed to watch carefully because overcooked noodles turned to mush and ruined the soup's texture. Fresh parsley chopped fine and stirred into the finished soup at the very end added bright green color and fresh flavor that made everything taste more vibrant and alive. The soup ladled into bowls while still steaming hot provided immediate warmth and comfort to sick family members who had no appetite for solid food. This healing soup fed 8 people for $1.58. The combination of savory broth, tender beef, soft vegetables, and comforting noodles provided complete nutrition without being heavy or difficult to digest. The warm liquid soothed sore throats and cleared stuffy noses better than any medicine. Kids ate soup even when they refused everything else during illness. The leftovers tasted even better the next day after the flavors married together overnight. Grandmas made huge pots and froze portions for future sick days when nobody felt well enough to cook. The tradition of making beef noodle soup from scratch for sick family members continued through the 1980s. What soup did your grandma make when you were sick? Ground beef and dumplings was the ultimate cold-weather comfort meal that grandmas made throughout the 1950s when families needed food that warmed them from the inside out during harsh winters in houses without central heating. They browned 1 pound of ground beef in large, heavy pots until the meat crumbled and turned golden brown. Diced onions and diced celery added to the beef cooked until the vegetables softened and released their flavors. The vegetables needed to be cut relatively small so they would cook quickly and distribute evenly throughout the stew. Beef broth poured into the pot covered the meat and vegetables by several inches and created the base for the stew that would cook the dumplings. Sliced carrots added to the broth contributed sweetness and color that made the finished dish more appealing and nutritious. Bay leaves, dried thyme, salt and pepper seasoned everything with herbs and spices. The stew brought to a boil, then reduced to a gentle simmer and cooked for 20 minutes while the flavors developed and the vegetables softened. The beef stayed tender and the broth reduced slightly and concentrated its flavors. While the stew simmered, grandmas mixed up the dumpling dough using flour, baking powder, salt, milk, and melted butter. The dough came together quickly and needed to be thick and sticky rather than smooth and elastic like bread dough. The dumpling dough dropped by large spoonfuls directly into the simmering stew created fluffy clouds that would steam on top of the liquid. The dumplings needed space between them to expand as they cooked, so grandmas placed them carefully around the surface of the stew without crowding. The pot covered tightly with a lid and the heat kept at a gentle simmer for exactly 15 minutes without removing the lid even once to peek inside. Opening the lid would release the steam that cooked the dumplings, and they would turn out dense and heavy instead of light and fluffy. After 15 minutes, the dumplings puffed up dramatically and became tender throughout. This hearty meal fed 8 people for $1.34 total. The combination of savory beef stew topped with fluffy dumplings created perfect comfort food that warmed cold bodies and lifted spirits during long, dark winters. The dumplings absorbed the flavorful broth and became incredibly tender and delicious. Kids loved pulling apart the fluffy dumplings and soaking them in gravy. The meal provided complete nutrition with protein from beef, vegetables for vitamins, and carbohydrates from dumplings for energy. Grandmas made this every single week throughout winter months, when families needed filling meals that stuck to ribs. By 1988, this labor-intensive meal disappeared as convenience foods and microwave dinners took over family tables. The tradition of making dumplings from scratch and steaming them on top of stew vanished along with the generation that understood that real comfort food required time and attention. Today, most people have never eaten homemade dumplings cooked in beef stew because restaurants don't serve it, and nobody teaches the technique anymore. Frozen biscuits replaced homemade dumplings in the few households that still make stew. The dumpling-making skill disappeared completely within one generation. Do you know how to make dumplings from scratch? Hamburger stew. Hamburger stew was the ultimate budget meal that grandmas made throughout the 1970s when inflation hit hard and families needed filling meals that cost almost nothing but still provided complete nutrition and satisfied everyone around the dinner table. They browned 1 pound of ground beef in large, heavy pots until the meat crumbled into small pieces and rendered its fat. The beef stayed in the pot with all the flavorful drippings because wasting any part of the meat was unthinkable during tight economic times. Diced onions added to the beef, cooked until soft and golden brown. Diced potatoes, sliced carrots, and sliced celery went into the pot next and stirred together with the beef and onions. The vegetables needed to be cut into uniform pieces about 1 inch square, so everything cooked evenly and finished at the same time. Beef broth poured over everything covered the meat and vegetables by 2 inches and created the stew base that would cook everything together. Some grandmas used water instead of broth and added bouillon cubes for flavor because it cost even less than canned broth. 2 cans of diced tomatoes with their juice added to the pot. Corn and beef skillet. Corn and beef skillet was the final forgotten ground beef stretcher that grandmas made throughout the 1960s when sweet corn season peaked in late summer, and they needed quick, easy meals that celebrated the harvest without requiring complicated preparations or expensive ingredients beyond the beef and fresh vegetables. They browned 1 pound of ground beef in large, deep skillets with high sides until the meat crumbled into small pieces and turned golden brown all over. Diced onions added to the beef cooked until soft and translucent. Fresh corn cut from the cob went directly into the skillet with the beef and onions. The corn kernels released their sweet milky juice and mixed with the savory beef fat to create natural sauce that bound everything together. Fuked white rice, stirred into the beef and corn mixture, stretched the meat even further and turned the skillet into a complete one-dish meal. 1 can of diced tomatoes with the juice poured over everything added acidity and moisture that prevented the rice from drying out during the final cooking. Shredded cheddar cheese, stirred into the hot mixture, melted into creamy strings that coated every grain of rice and kernel of corn. Salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar seasoned everything perfectly. The sugar enhanced the natural sweetness of the corn and balanced the acidic tomatoes. These 30 ground beef suppers, from emergency steak to corn and beef skillet, fed American families through the hardest decades between 1950 and 1980, when 1 pound of meat needed to stretch impossibly far to fill 8 hungry mouths. Grandmas mixed beef with rice, noodles, potatoes, oats, crackers, and vegetables to transform scarcity into abundance. Each recipe cost less than $2 and proved that Depression-era wisdom could feed entire families with dignity even during desperate times. By 1990, grocery stores started selling cheap chicken breasts and ground turkey that cost less than beef. Families abandoned these stretcher meals completely and forgot why their grandmothers had invented such clever techniques in the first place. Now nobody remembers how to make shipwreck casserole or hamburger corn pone pie or poor man's steak. These recipes defined an entire generation's approach to feeding large families on impossible budgets. They proved that creativity and resourcefulness mattered more than expensive ingredients. If your grandma made any of these ground beef stretchers regularly, dumpling making skill disappeared completely within one generation. Do you know how to make dumplings from scratch? Hamburger stew was the ultimate budget meal that grandmas made throughout the 1970s when inflation hit hard and families needed filling meals that cost almost nothing but still provided complete nutrition and satisfied everyone around the dinner table. They browned 1 pound of ground beef in large, heavy pots until the meat crumbled into small pieces and rendered its fat. The beef stayed in the pot with all the flavorful drippings because wasting any part of the meat was unthinkable during tight economic times. Diced onions added to the beef, cooked until soft and golden brown. Diced potatoes, sliced carrots, and sliced celery went into the pot next and stirred together with the beef and onions. The vegetables needed to be cut into uniform pieces about 1 inch square, so everything cooked evenly and finished at the same time. Beef broth poured over everything covered the meat and vegetables by 2 inches and created the stew base that would cook everything together. Some grandmas used water instead of broth and added bouillon cubes for flavor because it cost even less than canned broth. 2 cans of diced tomatoes with their juice added to the pot contributed acidity and sweetness that balanced the savory flavors. Bay leaves, dried thyme, salt, and pepper seasoned the stew generously. The mixture brought to a rolling boil, then the heat reduced to low for a long, slow simmer. The pot covered partially and cooked for 1 full hour while the vegetables softened and the flavors married together beautifully. The potatoes broke down slightly and thickened the broth naturally without needing flour or cornstarch. The carrots turned tender and sweet. The celery added subtle flavor without being overpowering. The beef stayed tender and flavorful throughout. The long, slow cooking allowed all the ingredients to meld together into one cohesive dish, where no single element stood out, but everything worked together perfectly. Some grandmas added frozen peas or green beans during the final 10 minutes of cooking for extra vegetables and color. The finished stew needed to be thick enough that a spoon stood upright in the middle, but thin enough to ladle easily into bowls. This economical meal fed 8 people for $1.62 total. The combination of tender beef, soft vegetables, and flavorful broth created perfect comfort food that satisfied hunger completely. The stew tasted even better the next day after sitting overnight in the refrigerator and allowing the flavors to develop further. Kids ate 2 bowls each and soaked up the broth with buttered bread. The meal provided everything a body needed: protein, carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals all in one pot. Grandmas made hamburger stew twice weekly throughout the 1970s when every penny mattered and feeding large families required constant vigilance over the grocery budget. The simplicity meant anyone could make it successfully, even without cooking experience. By 1995, canned stews became so convenient that families stopped making it from scratch. The tradition of slow-cooking stew all afternoon disappeared as microwave meals promised dinner in 5 minutes. Today, most people have never tasted real homemade hamburger stew, made by grandmas who stood at their stoves stirring pots and adding love with every spoonful. The patience required for slow cooking vanished from modern kitchens. What's your favorite stew vegetable? Corn and beef skillet was the final forgotten ground beef stretcher that grandmas made throughout the 1960s when sweet corn season peaked in late summer, and they needed quick, easy meals that celebrated the harvest without requiring complicated preparations or expensive ingredients beyond the beef and fresh vegetables. They browned 1 pound of ground beef in large, deep skillets with high sides until the meat crumbled into small pieces and turned golden brown all over. Diced onions added to the beef cooked until soft and translucent. fresh corn cut from the cob went directly into the skillet with the beef and onions. The corn kernels released their sweet milky juice and mixed with the savory beef fat to create natural sauce that bound everything together. Fuked white rice, stirred into the beef and corn mixture, stretched the meat even further and turned the skillet into a complete one-dish meal. 1 can of diced tomatoes, with the juice poured over everything, added acidity and moisture that prevented the rice from drying out during the final cooking. Shredded cheddar cheese, stirred into the hot mixture, melted into creamy strings that coated every grain of rice and kernel of corn. Salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar seasoned everything perfectly. The sugar enhanced the natural sweetness of the corn and balanced the acidic tomatoes. The entire skillet simmered gently for 10 minutes while all the flavors married together, and the rice absorbed the tomato juice. The corn turned tender, but still had a slight snap when bitten. The tomatoes broke down and created sauce. The cheese melted completely and bound everything into a cohesive dish. The beef stayed tender and flavorful throughout every bite. This colorful meal fed 8 people for $1.46 during peak corn season, when fresh ears cost almost nothing at farm stands and grocery stores. The combination of sweet corn, savory beef, fluffy rice, tangy tomatoes, and melted cheese hit every flavor note perfectly. Kids loved the sweetness of fresh corn mixed with the familiar comfort of ground beef. The bright yellow corn kernels scattered throughout made the dish look cheerful and appetizing on plates. Grandmas made this skillet meal 3 times weekly during August and September, when corn was at its absolute best. The recipe used up extra corn that might otherwise go to waste. Some grandmas froze corn kernels cut from the cob so they could make this dish throughout winter when fresh corn disappeared. The frozen corn worked nearly as well as fresh and brought summer flavors to cold winter nights. By 1992, this simple skillet meal disappeared as families ate out more frequently and cooking from scratch became less common. The tradition of celebrating seasonal vegetables with ground beef stretchers vanished along with the generation that understood that food tasted better when eaten at the peak of freshness. Today, almost nobody makes corn and beef skillet because restaurants don't serve it and cookbooks don't feature it. The recipe existed only in handwritten cards and grandmother's memories. The combination of ingredients seemed too simple to be worth making when elaborate recipes filled glossy magazines. But simplicity was exactly what made this meal perfect for busy grandmas who needed to feed large families without spending hours in the kitchen. The forgotten skillet meal represented everything good about Depression-era cooking: economy, nutrition, flavor, and speed, all combined in one pan. What's your favorite way to use fresh summer corn? These 30 ground beef suppers, from emergency steak to corn and beef skillet, fed American families through the hardest decades between 1950 and 1980, when 1 pound of meat needed to stretch impossibly far to fill 8 hungry mouths. Grandmas mixed beef with rice, noodles, potatoes, oats, crackers, and vegetables to transform scarcity into abundance. Each recipe cost less than $2 and proved that Depression-era wisdom could feed entire families with dignity even during desperate times. By 1990, grocery stores started selling cheap chicken breasts and ground turkey that cost less than beef. Families abandoned these stretcher meals completely and forgot why their grandmothers had invented such clever techniques in the first place. Now nobody remembers how to make shipwreck casserole or hamburger corn pone pie or poor man's steak. These recipes defined an entire generation's approach to feeding large families on impossible budgets. They proved that creativity and resourcefulness mattered more than expensive ingredients. If your grandma made any of these ground beef stretchers regularly, share this video with someone who needs to remember. The full ingredient lists and exact instructions are available in the description below. Don't let these forgotten suppers disappear forever. Subscribe so you never miss another lost recipe from America's past. Which one will you make first?